I'm just going to switch on my video, Sonja, otherwise it's so impersonal. Let me just check that it's holding my connection. So with that as background, I started talking to people on LinkedIn that had watched and that joined that webinar with me. And Sonja's name came up as the South African person to speak to when you are interested in these kind of topics and fields. And that is how I got hold of Sonja. And I think the one thing that I also realized through reading about this and listening to the webinar and so on, is that our traditional tools that we are so comfortable with, like root cause analysis, that has really stood the test of time for us in the past couple of years, may no longer be sufficient in the new environment. We need new tools, we need new coping strategies and mechanisms. So I really firmly believe, and that is why I was quite comfortable to ask Sonja to come and speak to us today. I firmly believe that her talk today will help us to foster these new mindsets and provide us with a new way of looking at ourselves, our skill sets, and how we adapt to this thing that we call the new normal. So, Sonja, thank you so much for joining. I can't wait to hear your presentation. I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Riane. Is it okay if I share my screen?
Yes, please.
Okay, just let me know if you are able to or not able to see it. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really flattered by your introduction. It's really interesting. I felt, or I thought, having worked in the field of complexity and uncertainty for so many years, that it would be easier for me to navigate the uncertainty that we're in right now. But I think, even for those of us who have different lenses of looking at this, it's very difficult. I thought what I'd do today is give you a basic introduction to what complexity is. So what is a complex adaptive system? How is it different from a complicated system or the ordered systems that we are more used to? And then what are the challenges that it poses for us, especially in the compliance community, and what are some of the things that we might need to do differently? So that's more or less where I'm planning to go. And then, please feel free to interrupt me if you have questions. So I thought I'll just start with an image. I think what I've been seeing, so I do a lot of work in corporates, both here and in other parts of the world. So one of my clients, for example, is the IKEA group. And I see the same thing everywhere. People are feeling, I think the best word to describe it is unmoored. It's as if we've lost our bearings, we've lost our moorings, and it feels like everything that used to be stable and that we used to know and could rely on has just suddenly disappeared. And it's really interesting to reflect on this, because apparently, some of what the research says is that the last few decades has been almost unnaturally stable. And I think many of us have kind of been lulled into a false sense of security that it will remain like that. So things like COVID-19, although we knew that there were pandemics in the past, it kind of took us by surprise. And there's been many really interesting conversations online on whether COVID-19 was a so-called black swan, for those of you who are familiar with Nassim Taleb's work, or not. And I think some of the consensus has been that it's not a black swan event, it's more like a black elephant. It's kind of the elephant in the room that everyone knew about, but we almost to an extent chose to ignore, or just chose to believe that it won't happen to us. And I think what we're seeing in the world at the moment is almost a bit of a vortex, if you want to call it that, of crises. We had COVID-19, and as if that wasn't enough, we also have, a lot of political and social instability. We've got the Black Lives Matter movement. And in many companies or countries, they are also experiencing things like heat waves and locust swarms on top of the pandemic. So I think we are a little bit in a perfect storm, and this does require us to really not only do differently or act differently, but also think differently. So one of the problems, I think, is, this is one of my favorite quotes by Diego Espinosa. And he says, we have outsourced our relationship with uncertainty to certainty merchants. And when I first read this, it really struck a chord with me. If you think about it, there are entire industries out there that are essentially structured around being certainty merchants. We think, for example, of things like the insurance industry. It's all around creating certainty for people. And I think sometimes we are also seduced into playing those roles internally in the organizations where we work. So we look to leaders to provide certainty for us, change managers, for example, even risk managers. A lot of this is around how can we bring certainty? How can we provide certainty? And I think to some extent, we've realized now that that is not entirely possible. Uncertainty is just a fact of life, and we need to find ways to befriend it, or at least not try and outsource our relationship with it. So how do we recultivate a relationship with uncertainty? And you'll see I chose as a picture here our relationship with weather. So I studied meteorology, and it seems like a different lifetime ago. So I come from the natural sciences. And I think even there, we're trying to make the natural world as uncertain or as certain as possible by trying to find better and better ways of forecasting, which has become a lot better in the last few years. But I think even those are starting to break down now with the changing climate patterns. So another thing that I've noticed is that there are these dominant narratives out there. It's almost as if we've internalized these narratives that says clarity and stability and predictability is good, and ambiguity, volatility, and uncertainty is bad. And we tolerate ambiguity and uncertainty for short periods, but then we want to go back to normal, which for us means back to stability and predictability. And these narratives are really being challenged at the moment, because people they start talking about what is the new normal in a way that is just other language for what is the next stable state where we will be hopefully be emerging into. And all the signs, the weak signals and the not so weak signals out there are pointing towards that ambiguity, volatility, and uncertainty essentially is the new normal, where most people are predicting multiple and even worse pandemics as global warming starts having an impact. Global warming itself, all of the climate change is going to bring a lot of unpredictability, and many people feel that the impact will dwarf what we're currently seeing with COVID-19. And then on top of that, we've also got, the rise of populist leaders, of fascism. The world has definitely, it's not going to become more stable anytime soon. And so we need to find ways of dealing with that. And a metaphor that I like to use, and this is what also became the tagline for this event, is it's hard to survive in the jungle if we were trained in a zoo. And it's interesting, I wrote a blog post on this, and it essentially went viral because I think it struck a chord, especially with senior leaders in organizations, but then also with people in the HR fraternity, the risk fraternity, because we've kind of bought into this idea that we live in an ordered, predictable world to such an extent that we've almost lost the skills that we need to be able to survive in a less certain environment. And even beyond skills, the structures that we have created, the way that we've set up our organizations, the way that the policies, the procedures, just the way that we're structured, are all based on this fundamental principle of predictability. And so in the post-COVID world, I think we need to think like chefs and not like recipe book users. And I saw in some of the reading that I was doing that there is a move in the compliance world towards principle-based versus rule-based. And that to me is almost the crux of the matter. If you think of a chef, I don't know how many of you also enjoy watching programs like MasterChef, but you can see the transition of people who are used to following recipes, who need to be told what to do, in our language almost follow checklists. As they transition to becoming chefs, they learn the principles of cooking, and therefore they are able to adapt when the context around them shifts. If I am reliant on a recipe or a checklist, and the things on my recipe or in my recipe that I need to bake my cake or make my stew is not available, or in South Africa maybe the power goes down and now my heat source is not available. If I don't understand the principles of cooking, I'm not able to adapt. And COVID-19, I think more than anything else, exposed some of the existing fault lines, not only in our societies and our political systems and our organizations, but also even just in how we think. And many organizations and countries were not able to adapt fast enough. When everything that we've set up, our old tools, our checklists, our recipes, when the context is no longer suited to those, and we don't have an adaptive capacity, we find ourselves really stuck. So we have a need to cultivate contextual intelligence. And you'll see the image that I've got on screen here is we need to understand that all systems are not the same. And we don't function only in one kind of a system. I think from the 60s onwards, and with the rise of process reengineering, Taylorism, even things like the learning organization, we've gotten very used to thinking that the business world is quite predictable. We can create structures within which there's order, we create predictability for ourselves. We believe that we can forecast, we can manage risk. There's a very strong metaphor at play that things are controllable, and therefore that we can predict and manage in particular ways. And so we've ignored context to a large extent, and we've assumed that practices are context agnostic. So, best practices, you can see this very often, people who, for example, a new article will come out in the Harvard Business Review, or, if some people call these fads, and we just think that we can transplant them from the context where they came from and just put them down in our organizations and they will work. And I think we've learned probably the hard way that doesn't work so well. A lot of my work is, for example, is working with agile transformations and people who want to cultivate strategic agility. And there we see time again, if you try and adopt practices from a particular context and you just put them down in yours, invariably they fail. And the underlying metaphor that we've been using is a mechanistic metaphor. So you'll see the image that I've got on screen at the moment of the car that has been taken apart. That is a mechanical system. It's quite what we would call complicated. I can take it apart, I can put it back together again, I can optimize the parts, nothing changes in the system. And this is how we've been treating our organizations to a large extent. You can see it in the language we use. So we would talk about what are the levers or the drivers for change. Very often when we go through restructurings, the imagery we would use would be of different business units or different teams being cogs that kind of turn each other. We're very we've been habituated into a metaphor that it's almost like a clockwork universe. But there's another kind of a context, and that is what we'll be spending some of our time on today. And I used an image here of a jungle or an ecosystem. But this is what we call a complex adaptive system. And there are very big differences between complex systems and complexity. and the more mechanistic systems that we have become used to or that we think that we're operating in. So I like to go back to the root words because I think that gives us a nice place to start. Complicated and complex. I think the normal way that we use these terms are not really helpful. So very often people would talk about, I've got a complex mathematical problem to solve. And what they actually mean is it's complicated. So complicatedness means enfolded. And you can see even on screen on the image, that is quite a complicated fold. It's almost like an origami fold. But what I can do is, if I've got enough time and I've got expertise, I can unfold it, completely understand it, refold it, and then I can also replicate the fold. Complexity is different. Complex means, or plex means woven together, but I prefer the word entangled. And the image that I've got on there is of our neurons in our brains. Complex systems are tangled in a way that we cannot ever fully understand. And I think COVID-19 has given us such a great example of this, because if you look at how it emerged and how it spread, things are connected in ways that we didn't expect. If we try to untangle it, we essentially break the system. We kill it. You can't untangle your brain cells. You also can't untangle an ecosystem. So there's no way to break it into its constituent parts to fully understand it. And there's also no way to fully control it. And so these two systems are very different. And we always kind of stand with one foot in the one and another foot in the other one. But to a large extent, we've ignored the complexity that we're in. Rianne, I want to take a pause and see if there are any questions so far.
No questions so far, but I think they've been. Everybody's just listening. Are there any questions to Sonja at this point? So Sonja, I think just maybe a question from my side. So we always try to order our worlds. That is just. So nature and everything in it, I think, always tends to go towards disorder, and then we try to order it. Is that a bad thing in itself, or is that something that is so part of who we are as human beings that we're not going to really get away from that?
I don't think it's a bad thing. I think, when we get into the Cynefin framework as well, we'll see there's nothing wrong with either of these two systems, and there's nothing wrong. Actually, creating order is a fundamental human skill. Nothing else so we can look at things like ant colonies and how birds flock. But in nature, there aren't any of the kind of ordered systems that human beings are able to create. I think where it becomes detrimental to us is if we almost become addicted to that order. And we imagine that we can control everything, and especially when we start, in a way, ignoring the inherent complex system that we are almost nested within. The thing with systems, so we create order. But even the most ordered system that we can imagine, like if we think, for example, about a nuclear power station, is an extremely ordered place, and it has to be. But that order is always fragile because it sits within a broader complex system where it only takes, as we saw with Fukushima, it only takes one big wave and suddenly the order becomes fragile and brittle. So order is a good thing. A lot of the technological advances, a lot of what we would call civilization has come from creating order. But if we take it too far, it becomes a problem.
Thank you.
Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. Thank you. There are no questions so far. They're finding it very interesting, some of the comments that I see here. So I think that's a go.
I'm going very, very fast, so I've got quite a bit to get through. So I just thought I'll take a pause. Sure. But what I just quickly want to go through is just what is it about complex systems that are so different from other systems, and what are the implications of that? So One key thing about complex systems is that they have emergent properties. So if you think of the car, the image of the car, a complicated system is equal to the sum of its parts. There is nothing, no property in that car that I can't explain by looking at the parts. Complex systems are different. They are not equal to the sum of their parts. So, for example, if you think of a city, so a city like New York, or a city like Johannesburg even, there is a vibe in the city. There is a particular culture. There's a way that things work that you cannot explain by just looking at the buildings and the streets and the people who live there. The image that I used here is again of our brains. So consciousness is an emergent property. We cannot explain consciousness by looking at the individual neurons. In an organization, culture is an emergent property. Even in a team, there's a culture in a team and an organization that emerges over years and years from the multiple, almost thousands of little interactions between people, between team members, between people and the environment, people and the technology. So culture can be shaped, but culture cannot be controlled or created. And this is very often, when I do these kinds of talks with organization development practitioners, this is quite a difficult thing for them to accept, because a lot of what we've been taught is that we can create ideal cultures. And that is simply not the case. We can shape a culture and we can try and change its evolutionary direction, but we cannot control it. And the way that we change culture is to change the interactions, to change how people connect, how people interact, to change the constituents, basically. We cannot create culture. And this is a really interesting thing for us to think about. I think a lot of, for example, IKEA, one of the projects that we were involved there was they wanted to create a compliance culture. I don't necessarily think having a compliance culture is necessarily a positive thing, but how does one go about doing that? There's this inherent need, I think, to change people's behavior. I think especially if people are at the moment not acting in ways that we need them to act. But trying to change people and trying to directly change culture is a very, very difficult task. So we need to think differently and think about what can we change in the environment? How can we change how people interact, how they connect with each other, the kind of environment that we put them in, the kind of processes and tools even that we provide for them. And out of that, a new culture will emerge and the behavior change will emerge that we're looking for. But people themselves are also inherently complex, and they are very adept at pretending to change and not actually changing. So we need to make sense of this idea of emergence. Then complex systems are dynamic and they are unique. So, the full term for complex system is a complex adaptive system. They are continually adapting to their environment. They are also continually co-evolving with the constituent agents. So a city from one day to the next is not the same. Even you as a person, so the family dynamics that you're in, things that you're exposed to, between today and tomorrow, you are not exactly the same person that you always used to be. Any ecosystem is continuously evolving, continuously changing. And the organizations and the markets that we find ourselves in are exactly the same. They are not static. And as we adapt to the system is also adapting to us, and it's adapting to its external environment. So we need to understand that whenever we are interacting with one of these systems, and all of the corporates, any kind of a business entity, a country, even just a community, a team even, is a complex adaptive system. And they are all unique. So something that works, for example, in ABSA will not work in Sasol, and it may not even work in Nedbank, even though it's the same industry. We really need to think about what does a fit for context approach look like? And I think that includes things like risk and compliance. One size simply does not fit all when we're dealing with complexity. And then, as Riani already mentioned, they are non-linear. So butterfly effects come from chaos theory, but it is a really just a good metaphor to use for this idea of non-linearity. But the basic idea is that small things can create really, really big impacts or changes in a completely different part of the system. And I think we've all seen that happen. We're definitely seeing it now with COVID-19. It only takes one or two people to break the social distancing and all the lockdown rules, and then the virus just spreads like wildfire. Another example of this, I don't know if you guys remember, a couple of years ago, Cell C had a really disgruntled client that was driving around Gauteng with a big billboard. So one disgruntled client can sink your brand. One small rumor can sink your culture. But the other side of this is also true. A really, really big multi-million rand culture change campaign can have zero impact. And so this non-linearity, we find it very uncomfortable because we are used almost to a Newtonian universe. I don't know how many of you can remember your school physics, but Newton basically, the Newtonian physics tell us every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So we kind of have this idea of linearity, that if I apply a certain amount of pressure, I will get a certain response. And in complex systems, it doesn't work like that. Things are also not connected in linear ways. We can't, one of the things that we'll get to is things like root cause analyses in a complex system becomes pretty problematic quite quickly because we don't have linear cause and effect relationships. And any effect can have multiple interacting causes, some of which we can't discover. So non-linearity is quite it's something that almost makes complex systems scary, but on the other hand, it also offers a lot of opportunity, because what this means is that small local actions can have really big impact. It can have system-wide impact. So we don't necessarily have to always go through for these really big interventions across the systems. Something small and local, done at the right time and in the right place, can have a really, really big impact. And so one of the things that we always say to people, when you find yourselves in complexity, think small and local, don't think system-wide, one size fits all. So
Sonja,
maybe just to...
Sorry, Sonja, there are two questions here. So Beulah is asking, please repeat the phrase fit for approach. And then Egbert, excuse me, Egbert's got a question. How do we position ourselves in the risk and compliance space to deal with the uniqueness and dynamics of the system we operate in, being non-linear on top of that?
So the phrase was fit for context. Yeah, Riani, I don't know that there is one answer to that question. I think, one of my favorite sayings is, in complexity, the right answer is always, it depends. But I think we need to start asking different questions. And I think we also need to become a bit more open, it's difficult because I think, I have to, just put all my cards on the table. I'm not an expert in compliance. My expertise lies more on the complexity side of things. But I think maybe let's revisit that question once I've gone through the Cynefin framework, because I think it will give us different language maybe to just have this conversation in, if that's okay.
Sure. Egbert, will you pose your question again at the end if you don't have an answer by then? Okay, he said fine.
Okay, cool. So I just quickly want to go through the mathematics of dots. I don't know if we have any actuaries in the room. I hope not, but I have double checked. But this is just to bring home a point, so if I have 4 dots, there are 6 possible links. Those are the red lines between those dots. 64 possible patterns can form. So if I go up to 10 dots, 45 links, maybe just quickly in the chat window, take a wild guess. How many possible patterns do you think can form? And Riani, I can't see the chat, so you can just let me know what answers.
I will do that. 1,280, 4,510. Be brave, guys. Pop a number. Oh, yes, I can't even read it. 10 million.
10 million, okay. It's so interesting. People think that they spot a pattern. So they see the 64 there, and then they think, if they put the 45 and the 10 together, it'll give them the answer. I'll put you guys out of your misery.
That's what Jackie did, she says. She followed the pattern. There's a 250, 250.
If I go to 12, I don't know how much that is, but I would love to have it in my bank account, even in Zim dollars.
Chorus is saying 3.45 trillion. Not bad, Chorus.
Yeah, I think he used the calculator.
I think he's an actuary. He's a closet actuary.
And that is the equation. It's a non-linear equation. But I think the point that I want to bring home with this is, I don't know how many of you have heard of this, the phrase, why did we not connect the dots? And root cause analysis, for example, is a really great way of connecting dots. Problem is that looking back, so in hindsight, I can see exactly which of these dots connected. A wonderful example of this is if you read the congressional report on 9/11. It is a wonderful, why did this agency not give that information to the other agency? Because then we could have stopped the terrorist attack. The problem is, if you think about how many dots there are in Al-Qaeda, that was one of 4.7 quadrillion patterns that could have formed. And in complexity, these patterns don't tend to repeat. So figuring out one pattern, we call this retrospective coherence. It might be helpful, and this is why things like root cause analyses, the 5 whys, all of these processes are really useful when we're in a complicated system. Because once we've figured out how the dots connected, then because we're in a predictable system, we can then stop those dots from connecting again. In a complex system, understanding one of these patterns will not help us predict or understand the next patterns. So complexity, hindsight does not lead to foresight. And this is also a key difference that people find quite challenging, because we are very used to the complicated world where this is not the case. Where if we can figure out how something happened, we can stop that same thing from happening again, and we can, in a way, manage that risk. Sometimes in complexity, risks don't repeat and they don't present in the same way twice. So again, we are back to the uniqueness. And then the one thing that is sure is there will be unintended consequences. That is the one thing that we do know about acting in complexity. And this is, again, a reason why we say in complex systems, do smaller things, act small and local, test what you want to do. I think policies and procedures in complex systems, because things are connected in ways we don't understand, implementing a blanket policy in one, even just in one area of a business, even if it's not even a blanket policy, implementing a policy in one area of a business without thinking about how that connects to other parts, or even in a country, we very often end up making things worse in another part of the system, or just having consequences that are the opposite of what we wanted to achieve. I think an example that we're currently seeing with this is the ban on cigarettes in South Africa now with COVID-19. I think it's probably very well intentioned, but now what's happening is it's creating a whole, it's essentially fueling the black market for tobacco products. So something that was done potentially because of a potential health impact is now having very, very unintended consequences in a different part of the system, which is in the economic system and even in the crime environment. So we need to think things through, and we need to take a systemic view. If we don't really think about the things that we're doing, the rules that we're putting in place, and their potential impact, we can create unintended consequences that can be very difficult to manage. And I'm sure you guys have multiple examples of where you've seen this. I don't know, Riani, if you maybe just want to take a few stories from people.
That's a great idea. Any stories, guys? Unintended consequences. I can think of the one in Australia, that all the toilet paper that sold out.
Yeah.
Maybe in the business side of things, any unintended consequences? We did something with good intentions and it turned out badly, or not as we intended. If you're welcome to stick up your hand and join the conversation. I think it might be a bit difficult in the chat room for this. Lynn? Lynn, you can unmute yourself and speak.
Hi, Riani. Hi, Sonja. Yeah, restructuring for the sake of restructuring and not understanding what the end goal looks like. And suddenly you sit with resources in the organization that don't understand what they should be doing, and those that do have left because they cannot deal that level of complexity and a misunderstanding around why are you doing what you're doing and what do you want to achieve.
Thanks, Lynn.
Thank you.
Sonja, do you want to respond to that? There's another hand up here. Beulah, shall we take Beulah's discussion and then,
Yes.
Beulah?
Hi, Sonja. I'm just thinking now of an unintended consequence. I was just thinking this week that we are now working from home during the time of course, and it's unintended, but thinking about the space we have, we've got large office. When I think about, overheads in terms of that, then would be ultimately, I'm just thinking, would the business not start? Well, people are working from home, they're active, do still need to come to the office. So I think that's one thing I'm about as an unintended consequence of us working from home during this time. I'm just raising that. I don't know what you think about that.
Thanks, Beulah. Anyone, do you want to respond to that, Sonja, while we wait for others to stick up their hands?
Yeah, I think lockdown and the move to working from home, I think we're going to see many unintended consequences. Yeah, I think we're also potentially looking at a bit of a second pandemic with mental health. So I think some of these things haven't completely played out. And I think also the consequences on teamwork and collaboration. I think the other thing is some unintended consequences are happy unintended consequences. They're not always bad. They're not always negative. I mean, there are a couple of so penicillin, for example, the antibiotic that essentially in a way changed the world. That was a happy accident. An unintended consequence of leaving petri dishes out. So sometimes these consequences are positive, but I think fertile ground for these are just policies and things that we choose to measure in our organizations, targets that we set. So there's an economist called Goodhart that essentially said, whenever a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. And we can see a lot of this everywhere. It's in organizations where, people are, for example, measured on not on customer service, but on the number of products that they sell, or in hospitals where people are measured on, how long people stay in the emergency department. There are stories from from some of the national health services outside of South Africa where people have died because nurses started moving patients around instead of caring for them because of a target. So those are kind of fertile ground to go and look for some of these things.
We've got Francis, and then I've just got Francis before you go. I've got Tabsile that's saying, I'm thinking that other unintended consequences could be that with the COVID-19, some companies could now look more towards robotics than before. That's a happy one. And then after Francis, Gigi. Francis?
So a lot of companies are digitalizing their businesses now and reducing headcount. And one of the problems with that is over a while now, we've experienced things like where the CCOM cables go down. And that online platform no longer works as effectively, and you would need those resources that you got rid of in order to continue with your daily function when your online platform is down.
Yeah, that is a good one. I think one of the things that COVID-19 has exposed is just how, I think one of the things that we've been really addicted to in the last few decades is efficiency. So we've almost over-optimized our organizations. We've made our supply chains and our, all of the infrastructure, we've made it brittle because we've stripped all of the redundancy out of it. And I think COVID-19 is showing us now the unintended consequences of that, all the centralization, the, over efficiency, actually.
That's an interesting concept, the brittleness. Wow, that's a very great comparison. Gigi?
Hi.
You can unmute.
I'd like to give an example from a European perspective. I'm in Germany at the moment, and I sort of move between South Africa and Germany. So I do spend a lot of time in Europe as well as in South Africa. And I also keep very close to what's happening in South Africa all the time. So of course, with COVID-19, I haven't been able to get to South Africa when I was supposed to be there. So I've spent more time in Europe than I intended to. But it also gives me a good perspective as to what's happening in South Africa and what's happening in Europe. So just at the moment in Germany, as with other European countries, the number of COVID-19 cases has reduced drastically, whereas in South Africa, it's currently on the rise. But what is happening in Germany is that there are pockets of issues cropping up. And one of the particular issues is within the slaughterhouses, within the meat companies in the slaughterhouses. And one of the unintended consequences that's come up is that they're realizing that because last month there were issues that cropped up at particular slaughterhouses within Germany, and now there's a massive outbreak at a large slaughterhouse, and over 1,500 employees at this particular slaughterhouse are currently testing positive. And they've now put 7,000 employees into quarantine. Is that they're realizing that the structure of these organizations and the way they function and the regulations and control of these organizations isn't what it should be. And what's already happening is Germany being a very proactive company and being, very pragmatic and very rules-based, they've already started the process of improving the working conditions and putting in better regulations and better control measures for those type of companies, because they've realized that there are things that should be a lot better and a lot of improvement is required. The difference between Germany's approach and the approach that tends to happen in South Africa is that in Germany, it happens quite quickly. So they've already been saying that from January next year, there will be improved and tightened up legislation. And they're already well on their way to getting that happening, because when there is a problem and when there is a crisis, they tend to react very quickly to it. And I've noticed that already this week.
Yeah, and I think that is a bit of it's almost like a bit of a I don't know what the word is, two-sided sword. Now I can only think of the Afrikaans. Because sometimes, fast action,
double-edged sword.
Double-edged sword, there we go. Sometimes, acting fast and being decisive, is really good. And then other times when we act too quickly and we don't take the time to understand all the dynamics, some of these new, the new legislation and the new policies that are put in place can again have unintended consequences. So it's always a bit of a balancing act. Is there another comment, or can we move on, Riani?
We can move on, Sonja. That was it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for that, guys. I want to start moving into the Cynefin framework, but I just quickly wanted to. This is a quote from an article that we wrote, myself and a friend of mine who's the head of risk at Eskom wrote a while ago. And it just really summarized this, so if we really are in an entangled world, and if we can't, if we assume that we can identify causes of uncertainty, we can establish controls to address them. If we're in that frame of mind and we think that, through things like root cause analyses, we can figure everything out and put the necessary controls in place, then complexity really is an interesting challenge for us, because if we can't isolate individual causes, remember the dots, we don't know which of those dots necessarily connected in which way. What can we control? And if we can't implement controls, then how do we manage risk? I think this is probably one of the key questions, and I don't necessarily have answers for this, but I think it is a conversation that needs to be had, or needs to be started at least, in the compliance and risk community, because up to now, I think most of the conversation has not been around how do we adapt to a complex world that is always shifting and where our current tools no longer work. So with that, I want to segue into the Cynefin framework. Oh, and just one last comment. I don't want you to be scared of complexity. I think we can't wish it away. We can't tame it. We can't simplify it. It's interesting in the general, literature like the Harvard Business Review. You'll very often see articles that's like simplifying complexity or taming complexity. I think is one that was in there a couple of months ago. We can't tame or simplify it, and it's not good or bad. It just is. And I think the key thing is you already know how to navigate it. If you've ever driven a car or navigated public transport, you have navigated complexity, because traffic is an example of a complex system. If you live in a city, if you socialize with friends, if you're part of an extended family, those are all complex adaptive systems, and we all understand how to navigate them. The problem is that when we come into our place of work, it's as if we forget about all of those skills and we just imagine ourselves to be in a very structured and ordered place that doesn't function like the rest of the world. So in a way, this is just reconnecting you to things that you already know how to do, but that we're not doing in business. So the Cynefin framework, sorry, I just looking for my cursor. Here we go. So this is Professor Dave Snowden. He is the author of the Cynefin sense-making framework. And his definition of sense-making is that we need to learn to make sense of the world so that we can act in it. So it's not sense-making just for the sake of sense-making. It is making sense in order to act. And the Cynefin framework actually turns 21 this year. So it was first published in 1999. There is a Harvard Business Review article that it's won several awards. I think it was published in 2007. But this is one of the most widely adopted sense-making frameworks in the world. Dave is on the verge of publishing a little booklet that he's co-authored along with the European Union, because they have adopted the framework very broadly to help them make sense and with decision making. If you're interested, I can distribute the Harvard article through Riani if you'd like to read it.
That would be great. Thank you. Sonja, maybe you can just spell. Are you showing how we spell that Cynefin? If people want to read up on it.
Yes, it's Cynefin.
Oh, you are.
It's
okay.
It's a Welsh word. It means place of our multiple belongings. There's no direct English translation for it, but it means that sense that who we are today and how we think and where we are is interconnected with, ancestors, with multiple experiences we've had, with places where we've lived, and we can never be fully aware of it. So it's a kind of a complex Welsh word. So the Cynefin framework, and I thought what I'll do is I will just use some COVID-19 examples to explain some of it. So what you'll see on the right-hand side of the framework is the world of order. So we've already spoken about the difference between complicated and complex. Now what Cynefin does is it distinguishes between two different kinds of order. One is where the cause and effect relationships are clear. So they're obvious, they're self-evident to anybody. And this is where we can sense, we categorize because we've seen it before, and then we respond. We're dealing with known knowns, and this is the legitimate domain of best practice. Now, if we take COVID examples, this would be, you need to wash your hands for 20 seconds. If you have any symptoms, you need to immediately self-isolate. I think in the compliance world, there are many of our practices and our tools that work very, very well in the world of clear order. I think the key difference between clear and complicated is that here everything is known. We are not, if you think, for example, of the accounting world, they are not inventing any new rules or nothing is really, we're not learning anything about the world of accounting. It is a known. Things that sit in this clear domain can also be automated because everything is known. So what we're starting to see is automation, all of those things, the jobs that we still have in our organizations that sit in this category, they are being automated. If we go to complicated, here we're dealing with known unknowns. We know what we don't know, but the key thing that's the same between these two ordered domains is that the outcome is known and the outcome is not dynamic. The outcome is staying stable. So here what I need to do is I need to sense what the problem is or the context is. I need to analyze and then I need to respond. So this is where I apply good practice. This is where you can apply things like design thinking. And this is the legitimate domain of the expert. So if we think COVID-19, there are all kinds of debates around, should we wear masks? Shouldn't we wear masks? What must the masks look like? Everybody that's looking for a potential vaccine, although I think that there's a lot of experimenting going on in that space as well. But this is another space where we are very comfortable. So we understand what the question is. We know what the outcome is where we need to get to. We're just not entirely sure how to get there. But a key thing is that on this side of the framework, outcomes are known. If I go to the left-hand side of the framework, on the top left, we've got complexity. We've already spoken about that. And the key thing here is that we're dealing with unknown unknowns. very often in a complex system, I can see surface level patterns. I can see, it's almost like I can see symptoms, but I don't fully understand what the problem is, and I don't really even know what the question is that I need to be asking. I need to interact with the system to learn about it, to start understanding the dynamics before I can start intervening. So here we're looking at emergent practice, and we conduct safe to fail experiments. And this is a really interesting, some organizations, when I use the words safe to fail, there's an immediate, almost like an allergic reaction, because we're very used to fail-safe design. We essentially try and eliminate failure. And I think there are some contexts where we have to, because we can't afford a failure there. But in complexity, failure to an extent is unavoidable. So here we need to focus on fast detection and fast recovery. We can't prevent failure. And I think, from a risk management perspective, that is quite a difficult thing to make peace with. So some examples in the complex domain, anything that involves people needing to regulate themselves, so how do we get an entire nation to maintain, I don't like the word social distancing, physical distancing? Even things like the ban on cigarettes and the impact and the dynamics and the consequences that it created. We were dealing with unknown unknowns. We don't really know how to deal with this pandemic, and many of the things that we put in place require people to change their behavior. And some of the interventions we put in place have unintended consequences, as we've already discussed. Then the final domain is that of chaos. Now, this is not exactly the same as what the word is used when we talk about chaos theory. In our language, chaos is an unconstrained environment. There are no effective constraints. It's a domain of crisis, and we tend to fall into chaos. But a system does not stay in chaos. So a system can remain in any of the other domains, but it doesn't stay in chaos very long. Here we're dealing with unknowable unknowns, and this is where we get novel practice and also to some extent innovation. And what we need to do in chaos is we need to act before we sense or respond, because we are not able to observe patterns. So for example, the lockdowns that were implemented, that was a form of, it's almost like a command and control draconian act, so that we can stabilize the system, sense patterns, and then know how to respond. I think when some of what we've seen in places like New York and in Italy, and apparently there are areas in our country now that's approaching that, where our emergency rooms are overrun and we are not able to deal with all of the deaths. So we can't, we can't bury everybody. We basically sitting with a crisis on a health level that is potentially chaotic, and how we deal with that is going to be telling. And then on the boundary here, I put, what we saw in the US, for example, was lots of action by people saying we would rather be free than, we would rather have COVID than not be free. So we, all of these, things like even Black Lives Matter at the moment, they are not necessarily completely unpredictable, and there are patterns there. So they're not completely chaotic, but they are essentially keeping the system in complexity. And then in the middle, we've got the fifth domain, which is that of confusion, where we don't know enough to fully understand in which of the other domains we're in. And then just one last thing that I wanted to talk about. You'll see right at the bottom here, there's a little hook. Now, if you could see this framework in 3D, these, where my cursor is now, these domains, or this is flat. This boundary here between clear and chaotic is a cliff. And essentially what happens is if we put too many rules in place in a system, so there are two ways that we can fall over that cliff. One is we over-constrain the system. And we see this very often, for example, with health and safety, but also with financial regulations in companies. So we tend to manage towards the lowest common denominator. So we end up with systems that have so many rules that, for example, I cannot even get a legitimate expense claim paid. And that is when people start working around the system, they start working around the rules. And what we find then is we create a culture where it becomes okay to act unethically and to break rules. And that is when we fall over the cliff into chaos. Another way that that can happen is if we become complacent. So if we believe certain things won't happen to us, or if we, you must have heard of this expression of a Kodak moment. It's when we are so complacent in our success in a way that we cannot see the emerging risk coming from the marketplace that we need to adapt. And once it becomes clear enough, it's already too late, and we again fall over the cliff into chaos. So one of the key things that we always need to be looking out for, especially in an organization where there are large parts of the system that is sitting within this ordered domain, and in particular in the domain of clear order. This could be things even like manufacturing contexts. We always need to be scanning the environment and making sure that we are not complacent and that there are not things that we are not seeing that's already emerging in the market. Riani, I'm going to pause again. Sure. This was a mouthful.
Any questions from anybody on the Cynefin framework? It's quite an interesting way of understanding where we are. I've got no questions. Any hands going up?
While we wait, Riani, I think something that I forgot to mention that I think is really important here is that one of the key things with Cynefin is it positions all of our existing tools and methods. So I think the complexity message is not that we need to abandon everything that we've done so far, all of our methods and best practices. It's just understanding what are the boundaries within which they apply and where they work, and where don't they apply and where can they actually end up making things worse. So things like root cause analyses and all of the other, I'm not familiar with all of your tools, but for example, checklists work perfectly well when you're in the clear domain of Cynefin. I think many of the compliance processes are very suited to the ordered domains. Root cause analyses, all of those things, they work perfectly well within the complicated domain. It's when we start using them when we're in a complex domain, when we start making things worse or not making any difference. So we need different ways of functioning there.
Absolutely. I think, Sonja, also, there's probably an element of letting go of what's known to you and that feels safe and comfortable, and trusting yourself to, as you said, we're already navigating many complex systems. Mm-hmm. We must trust ourselves, when we are in these scenarios and situations, is to let us think and go there where we're uncomfortable.
Mm. And I think another thing, Riani, is what complexity is calling us to do as well is to really use our brains and to think critically. And I think we need people across our organizations, not only, people in central functions, but, something, for example, that is responsible. So following a defined checklist is responsible, and that is what we need to do when we are in the clear domain of Cynefin. So if the context hasn't changed, everything is as it should be, it's the responsible thing to do, and that is how we comply with the rules. If the context has shifted and we are in a complex domain and things have become dynamic, following that same checklist could actually be irresponsible. It could lead to a massive failure just because the context has shifted. And so we really need to start, creating cultures in our workforce where people are able to question and where they are able to think critically.
Exactly. So these are new skills if they're underdeveloped, something that we should look at within ourselves to develop that. Are there any other questions or comments? Perhaps Tasneem, you've got your hand up.
Yes, I was just thinking now of an example which speaks to what Sonja just said. If you think about, people have mentioned that COVID has resulted in a move to more digitized online capabilities, etc. So as an example, if you're in a business who was not necessarily prepared for that, COVID would have forced you to almost come up with means to enable that kind of interaction with your clients. So a simple example, an application form. Typically, you get an application form and it's signed. Now, all of a sudden, you know, you can't get an application with a signature. So you have to be able to apply that thinking to say, well, what is a suitable alternative? And out go your traditional compliance requirements. You know, you need to see the client's signature, etc., etc. And you've got to come up with a compromise, which is very much outside of the traditional framework that we've been used to. So it was just a practical example I wanted to share because it speaks so nicely to what you were just saying, Sonja.
Yes, thank you for that. I know that in some of the other calls that I've been involved in, you know, we had some really interesting conversations about some of the problems that the estate agents face, because there's almost no way to do, you know, that whole legal process virtually. So the entire industry almost ground to a halt with COVID-19.
Any other questions or comments to Sonja? Here's another hand up, Egbert.
Thank you, Sonja. Perhaps just on the framework again, if you could just spend a few more minutes on understanding the boundaries between the various areas, just to help us in our thinking to apply it. And I know one thing that came up for me is a lot of our legislation are moving from rules-based to principle-based. And I think in this regard, we're moving from the clear perhaps to the complicated and sometimes even complex. But if you can perhaps just help us in understanding the cliff between the areas, perhaps the boundaries.
Sure. So the boundary between clear and complicated is actually, it's almost like an artificial boundary. You know, sometimes the only difference between whether something is clear or complicated is based on my level of expertise. You know, so if I give you an example, if my car suddenly, you know, multiple lights come on, stop next to the road, for me, that is hugely complicated because I've never worked on a car engine before. But for an experienced mechanic, it might be clear exactly what the problem is without even analyzing. So this is a bit of an artificial boundary. But the key thing here is that this is, you know, the world where outcomes are known, where we've, you know, I think maybe what I can use a little bit to make this clearer for you is this is where we've got governing constraints. So if you think about rules, laws, they govern what can happen in a system. So they completely, in a way, control the behavior of the agents and what can happen in that system. So in clear order, we've got rigid constraints. In complicated, but in this whole order domain, we've got governing constraints that essentially exerts top-down control. This boundary here it's almost like a state change. You know, so if you think of when you boil water, when it goes from liquid to vapor, that kind of a change is between this side of the framework and this side of the framework. So here the boundary is not a cliff like it is down here, but it is a very significant boundary. And it is a shift from governing constraints to what we call enabling constraints. And principles, depending on how you use principles, you know, the idea with the principle, I think this is how I imply, or how I think about a principle, is there is room to interpret. So it almost creates a scaffolding and enabling constraints within which there are options. And it's up to your discretion how you are going to interpret it for the particular context. So in complexity, we don't have these governing constraints that determine what can happen in a system. We've got enabling constraints within which things emerge. And so this is a very important boundary, but it is one that you can cross quite slowly. There is actually a dynamic that sits between these two domains, which is the continuous learning or the continuous improvement dynamic, where I can relax constraints so that I can explore in complexity. And then if I find something that looks as if it's promising, I can then put more constraint in place, put more governing constraints in place, and move it back across that boundary so that I can exploit it. Between complex and chaos, it's also quite flat. And the key difference here is that whereas in complexity, we've got these enabling constraints that allow patterns to emerge, in chaos, there's no effective constraints. So things are in the very real, they're random. There's no constraint, but it doesn't last for a very long time. You know, something will bring constraint very quickly. So if you think, for example, of 9/11, just after the airplanes went into those buildings, that would have been chaotic. It's a chaotic moment. But as soon as patterns start emerging, we're in complex. The dangerous boundary here is this cliff at the bottom that we've already discussed. You know, and also another thing that's dangerous is to get stuck in this confused space in the middle. And something that can happen is if we think that we are in a complicated environment where the outcomes are known, contexts are not dynamic, and we operate as if that is the truth, but actually we're in complexity, that also has there's a danger there that we can also collapse into chaos. So it really goes back to the ability to just at least see and understand that we are not always working in predictable and ordered systems, that our systems are nested within larger complex systems, which always brings a measure of uncertainty and unpredictability, and therefore to not be so wedded to our processes and our checklists and our tools and the way that we see the world, that when the context does shift, that we're not able to respond. I hope that helped.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
I think if you read the Harvard article, it'll also, you know, it was very clearly articulated there. It just, you know, when that was written, clear was still called simple order. So there's a little bit of a language difference, but the rest is still the same.
Thanks. And you will send that to us, Sonja, and then we'll send it to all of you.
Yes.
Any other questions for Sonja? Comments? Remarks? Sonja, is anything else from your side?
Rihanna,
was this the last slide?
No, it wasn't. I just need, so I wanted to play a video for you. I'm going to skip that. I just want to go to my second last slide and just quickly, because up to now, I haven't really given you any pointers in terms of what you can potentially do. I think one of the key mindset shifts that we need to make is from a problem-solving mindset, because a problem, if we think that we've identified a problem and we're looking for a solution, we are immediately trapped in linear thinking, which puts us in the complicated or the ordered world. We need to start switching towards sense making. So the framework I just showed you is a sense making framework, but there are also 3 sense making processes that I thought would be useful, and they go in a sequence, but they are 3 separate processes. But it's essentially see, attend, and act. So under see is, can I see what am I seeing? Am I scanning broadly enough? So some of the things that you want to be doing here is to look for patterns, not individual causes, not root causes, not problems or solutions, but look for patterns in how things are connecting. Focus on how things relate to each other and how they connect, not necessarily the things themselves. Increase the diversity. So try and see through many eyes. I think, we don't see what we don't expect to see, and we all have biases. So especially when we find ourselves in complexity and chaos, we immediately need to increase the diversity, for example, of experts we listen to. We need to get to the people who are closest to the actual problem. So the frontline people, we need to get their perspectives. And we also need to pay attention to outliers. We can't afford to only look at dominant patterns. We need to pay attention to outliers, because that might be the weak signals of a new pattern that's emerging. So we really need to learn to pay attention to and to cultivate diverse feedback mechanisms and data sources. We can't afford to scan too narrowly. So C is all around, how do I broaden my feedback and also the data that I'm looking at, and how do I look for different things? So C is the one. Then attend is, if I can see, do I know that it's important? Do I know that I need to pay attention to it? And it's a separate process. So here, we need to really cultivate curiosity and not assume that we know what matters, because the context may have shifted to such an extent that something that didn't matter last week might matter now. So this is about remaining open to perspectives other than my own, to new questions, to new data. Again, to look for emerging weak signals. In complexity, when somebody says, we've tried that before, it didn't work, or, this isn't this isn't important, that is never a valid argument, because you don't know what's happened in the external environment. So we need to learn to be pattern spotters. And then the final process here is, if I can see it and I know that it's important, am I able to act on it? And here we need to, again, feedback mechanisms is so important for us. We need feedback mechanisms that allow responses that match real-time needs. So how do we become more responsive? And we need to establish safe cultures where even those on the front line feel empowered to act. Very often, once we've gone through the multiple layers in our organization, the time to act has passed. And we need to cultivate experimental mindsets. So when we are in that space where we are thinking of principles, not rules, how do we experiment so that we can test different options, so that we can see how we can better align, for example, to the organization's strategy, or to the overall direction or the intent of the law or the principles that we're looking at. I think this is about the spirit of it, not the letter of it. So see, attend, and act. These are three things that we can, three different sense-making modalities that we can cultivate. And then one last slide, Riani. This is my final one, but I think this is really interesting, because we look at managing, we talk about managing risk. It's like, managing in anything that we want to manage. And it's really useful to go back again to the original verb, because initially it came from the Italian, which I'm not even going to try to translate, but it meant handling and training a horse, essentially riding a horse in dressage. And I don't know how many of you have ever ridden a horse, but it is a partnership. It is a co-evolving, co-evolutionary relationship. So we're learning with, adapting to, respecting, and working with another complex entity. And then in the 18th century, the French term, which basically meant household, came into the picture, and the two came together, and it created this term that is essentially managing a household. So the metaphor of an obedient machine with, controlling and directing. And I think what we need to do is we need to go back to the original meaning of what manage actually is. And it is not about commanding and controlling. It is about co-evolving, learning with others, and continuously adapting to the context. And that was my last one.
That's profound advice. I just want to check, Nikki, do you quickly want to ask Sonja your question, or has she answered it?
Riani, thank you. Sonja, I think I was just looking for some, because you're speaking about cultivating and learning to sense make rather than problem solve. Any suggestions as to how we can cultivate it? Because I imagine it's not a, you can just overnight look at things a bit differently. So are there ways or things we can read, or how, are there suggestions from you?
So you can, so frameworks, for example, like Cynefin will definitely be helpful. I think there's a book that I would recommend there are two books actually. One of my favorite authors, and I'll put it in the chat for you. Her name is Jennifer Garvey Berger. She wrote two books. One is Simple Habits for Complex Times, and the other is the 5 Leadership Mind Traps in Complexity. But in Simple Habits, she basically, it's 3 very simple things. It's essentially learning to ask different questions, learning to see from multiple perspectives, and learning to see the system. And I think that is probably a really good place to start, because if we can just, in a way, become more curious and also cultivate humility, because I think a lot of this is around, we think that we know and we want to be right, and then we don't look broader than just what's right in front of us. So I think digging into curiosity, asking different questions, and then I think the other thing is surround yourself with people that think radically different than you do. Because we don't tend to do that. We like to be with people who think like us, because it's easier. But I think diversity is one of the key things to cultivate, even in your individual network. I hope that helps.
Nikki has responded. Yeah. Sonja, so far, very, very good feedback here. Thank you very much. Very insightful, very informative, thought-provoking. Truly introspective. Those are the kind of comments that are coming through here. Yeah, so any other last questions to Sonja? Jackie says dit aan jou lippe gehang, Sonja.
Dit hoekom hulle so seer is. Thanks, Jackie. I think I threw a lot at you, but this is very much just scratching the surface. So I hope it wasn't information overload.
It was, but it's very, I think there's a lot to take home with us. We'll take with us, Lynn. Lynn, do you have a comment? I'm just answering. So just so that, yeah, sorry, Lynn. Lynn? Do you want to unmute yourself and then you can speak?
Super, thank you. Thank you, Sonja. It was amazing and very insightful. I just wanted to share something that I stumbled upon the other night when I was watching the comments from very, very informed people around BLM. And it was a Professor Carol Anderson, and she said, with so much attention on the flames, everybody is ignoring the kindling.
Mm.
And I think that's where we find ourselves from a rules versus a principle-based environment now. There are things that are starting to come up that we've never seen before, that are both complicated and complex, and trying to navigate through that maze is very, very difficult. But thank you for what you've shared with us today. It was wonderful.
Thank you. Maybe just, do I have time to respond to that, Riani?
Yes, of course.
I think One tip that I would give you, and you know, the thing with complexity is it's always a bit counterintuitive. You know, at the moment, everyone is going faster and trying to do more. And I think one of the best things we can do for ourselves is to give ourselves time to think, to take a step back. Because as you said, you know, we can get so distracted by the flames, we forget about the kindling. In the practice of adaptive leadership, Ron Heifetz talks about get off the dance floor and onto the balcony. And I think while we're in the dance and it's quite frenetic and we're trying to make sense, you know, it's very, very difficult to be able to see the patterns. If we can take a step back and take some time and just get a different perspective and almost go and stand on the balcony and observe the dance, that's when I think we get some of the insights that we need.
That's brilliant analogies. Thank you, Sonja. It looks like we came to the end of the comments and the questions. I think from my side, Sonja, I have a very favorite phrase that I don't overuse, but I would like to use it right now. And that is that once a mind is stretched by a new idea, it never regains its original proportions. And I'm really hoping that each and every one of us, and by the sound of it, everybody's taken the names of the books and so on. I think we've started a little fire here. By the looks of it, and I really wish that upon everybody. So thank you for your profound insights and advice. It's really been a great afternoon to spend with you. A lot of thoughts to take with us, a lot of learning points to take with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for spending the time.
Thank you everyone. The video will be recorded and it will be on our YouTube channel if you want to go and revisit it. We'll send you the link.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sonja. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.